We all experience challenging and difficult situations in life. In the face of these complexities, it is not always clear how to respond, what to do, or what to avoid. It's easy to get stuck in these moments and stop moving forward in life. Wholeness with Naomi is a program that explores our experiences with such encounters and provides tools and strategies that can enable anyone facing these hardships to continue walking their path in life. We can't wait to meet you on this journey. Tune in, your life is about to change for the better.
Welcome to our program, Wholeness with Naomi, where we talk about difficult and sometimes different situations that we find ourselves in. More importantly, we talk about the tools that you can use as you navigate in these difficult and different life paths that you may be walking in. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the subject of autism. It's a condition. It's something that some of us have actually experienced, or we know someone that has experienced it. Joining us on the program today is Dr. Mudawarima, who is a developmental pediatrician, who's going to share more light on this subject, what it is not, and also to demystify some of the myths and misconceptions surrounding this condition. Welcome, Dr. Mudawarima, on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're talking about the condition of autism. Maybe if you can just start by sharing what it is.
So autism is a developmental condition. When I say developmental, it's a condition that starts early on in life when the child is still developing.
Okay.
And it comprises of two main areas of difficulty that we use to make our diagnosis, and those areas are difficulties with social communication, as well as some behaviors that we see, such as restricted repetitive behaviors, insisting on things kind of being the same all the time, having intense interests, as well as sensory difficulties. Having said that, although we use these criteria in order to make the diagnosis, they do not describe a whole person, and each individual is unique and gifted in different ways. Okay. It's also important to realize that for each symptom that we talk about, each individual is going to have different severities for the different symptoms that we use to make the diagnosis.
Okay, so from what you're sharing, it differs according to each person?
It does differ according to each person.
Okay, that's interesting to note. I would love to also just find out what is it not. I know there are many myths and misconceptions around this particular condition. Maybe you can also just take us through what is autism not.
So some of the things that can be confused with autism spectrum disorder are things like intellectual disability, where an individual has difficulty processing information from an intellectual perspective. It is not a physical disability such as cerebral palsy. It is not some of the more common conditions that we encounter, such as Down syndrome, which we see very often. However, it doesn't mean that someone who has those other conditions cannot also have an additional diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Just also, it's something that we are encountering a lot more often. What is contributing to that?
I think our society now is a lot more open than it used to be. Okay. From what I am seeing on a day-to-day basis, people are more likely to come out and actually seek a diagnosis for their child when they notice that there are difficulties with, the different areas of social communication and some of the behavior challenges that they would encounter. It does not mean that autism wasn't there and it's a new thing. I believe that it's something that's always been there. However, the capacity to make the diagnosis has not always been available. And so there were some children who did not get diagnoses, 30, 40, 50 years ago, who, when we look at it today, may actually fall under those diagnostic criteria and be formally diagnosed as having autism. There's also been a lot of stigma in the past around children who have disabilities and developmental conditions, and some tendency to keep them in the home, keep them hidden away from members of the public, with only a select few people knowing about it. I think in Western cultures they talk about the individual in the basement, who was always hidden away. Uncle so-and-so lives in the basement, because they had some kind of disability, and so the family did what they could in order to contain the situation. I think in urban areas, a lot of children who were picked up to have difficulties in our context would have been shipped off to the rural areas, and because we're a lot more remote and separated in the rural areas, the neighbors may not necessarily have been aware of the fact that there is a child who has such circumstances. So it's now we're in closer confined spaces. We know what's going on with the family next door, and now families are no longer locking the children in the cupboard, they're actually bringing them out. And so we're becoming more and more aware that there's such a condition that exists.
It is sad to know that was happening. And it's also, what is really striking out is also the stigma that is surrounded that particular condition, that because of that, people were not able to bring out their children to be themselves, but they would hide them.
I think across the board, when we talk about disability, this has always been a problem that we've encountered, and I really want to commend people who have lived with disabilities and lived with individuals who have disabilities for their work in trying to ensure that awareness has improved over the years.
Thank you so much for that sharing, Dr. Mudawarima. What are some of the signs and symptoms that parents or caregivers can look out for?
So I want to look at it from the perspective of the things that families would have noticed when they eventually come, so that we go through the diagnostic process. A lot of the time, one of the main presenting complaints is language delay.
Okay.
Although it's not always the case that an individual who has autism spectrum disorder has associated language delay, but very often there is, a history of not talking at the time that one is expected to talk. Another issue that can come with language is one where sometimes a child has started to acquire words and then suddenly they lose the ability to use those words. Some of the other things that families notice is that although a child may have several words that they are able to use, they don't necessarily use those words to come and communicate with them. So, it's them reciting things or singing along or that kind of thing, and not coming to the parent to say, look mum, or look dad, or look auntie or uncle or granny or grandpa, this is what I've seen.
So they're using signals.
So they're using words, but they're not using them to communicate, especially that social aspect of communication. Okay. Some of the other things that we see are difficulties with nonverbal communication. So things like not making eye contact when they are communicating, not using, facial expressions or gestures in order to communicate with other people around them, or also having difficulty understanding nonverbal communication cues such as, gestures, pointing, facial expressions, and having difficulty really reading what the mood is of the people who are around them because of those difficulties that they have. And then sometimes, the behaviors can be a big issue. So things like, they're doing the same things all the time. They play in an unusual way when they're given toys instead of playing, in the way that we would expect. Maybe they're grouping things, maybe they're pulling things apart, maybe they're spinning wheels instead of actually playing the games that you would expect. So those are some of the things that parents will come with when they're worried that something is going on with their child. And then as we go down the diagnostic process, then we eventually come to the conclusion that this is autism spectrum disorder.
Thank you so much for that sharing, Dr. Mudawarima. Viewers, let's take a short break to join me in the next segment. Thank you. Welcome back to our program, Wholeness with Naomi. Before we went on a short break, Dr. Mudawarima was just sharing with us some of the signs and symptoms that a parent or a caregiver should look out for in a child at home. Is autism gender specific?
Autism is not gender specific. However, we have tended to make the diagnosis more in boys than in girls.
Okay.
I think the information and research that is starting to come out now is showing that with girls, what tends to happen is that their interest in the way that they play, although it may be repetitive, they try and model it as closely as possible to what they see other little girls doing. In other words, they kind of mask some of their behaviors. So it's a lot more difficult to pick it up in little girls than it is to pick it up in little boys. However, we do make diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder in children of both genders. It is, however, much more common to make an adult diagnosis of autism, a new adult diagnosis of autism in girls or women than it is in boys, simply because of the whole issue of masking and how we don't always think through those behaviors when we see them in girls as opposed to when we see them in little boys.
Thank you so much for that. What are some of the emotional and psychological issues surrounding this condition, especially with caregivers and parents?
So with regards to this topic, I can only speak to it from this perspective of one who is seeing it from the outside when I encounter the individuals that I work with and make diagnoses on their children. So I want to make the proviso that this is not necessarily the lived experience of someone who has a child who has autism spectrum disorder, and therefore going to be limitations to what I say about this. But it is a big emotional task for a parent to parent someone who is on the autism spectrum sometimes. There are going to be differences based on the severity and the functional level of the individual. And the burden is likely to be more when you have someone who is lower functioning on the spectrum, who has what we would describe as very substantial support needs. Simply because everything is relying on the caregiver. So the caregiver is having to facilitate everything. They're having to basically try and figure out what the child wants based on the things that are happening around them, because the child is not necessarily going to be able to communicate to them directly. They're having to try and facilitate social engagement with other individuals. They're having to, on almost a daily basis, explain to other people who don't understand why their child is behaving the way that they're behaving in situations where we're expecting calmer behavior or quote unquote better behavior.
And that makes public spaces difficult.
I think one of the things that a parent has most recently said to me was, and I think this was someone that I saw the day before yesterday, the mother said to me, I go places and people say to me, in other words, that she does not discipline her child, when actually this is a child who actually has a severe developmental disorder, and the behavior that they are seeing is not because of lack of effort on the part of the mother. So people place a lot of judgment on the caregivers who come with a child who, for example, may be having a meltdown because the situation is too overwhelming for them, because there's so much sensory stimulation and there's so much social stimulation, and they're not able to handle it. So from that perspective, it can be very burdensome to parents and caregivers. I think some of the things that we see are families breaking apart, children.
I've heard of such cases as well, the parents or the dad moving away.
Mothers move away, fathers move away, and in some instances, children are dumped with grandparents and left, and parents go and live their own lives. It's a very difficult situation to navigate for a lot of families. And then there are those families who really, really work hard to try and do their best for their children and do whatever it is that they can. But, although their families stay together, it doesn't mean that the burden is any less. These families, sometimes have a lot on their plates that they're having to handle.
Thank you so much for that. So from what you were sharing on some of the signs and symptoms a parent should look out for, I'm a parent, I've identified some of those things. What should I do? What's my first step?
So I don't want to be too prescriptive because the actions that one takes are going to depend on where one is. We have, different provinces in Zimbabwe, and the pathway to care may be different in those places and spaces. I'll speak about what I know from an urban Harare setting, that a lot of the time when there's a language delay, families are encouraged to go to the local clinic. We also have services for diagnosis at Sali Mugabe Central Hospital, so we have our children's rehabilitation unit there. There's also the Harare psychiatric unit that is housed at Sali Mugabe Central Hospital, and there are psychiatrists there who can make the diagnosis. We also have rehabilitation facilities there in order to try and help families to manage some of the behaviors that we see. There's also a service at the Parrenyatwa psychiatric unit, what used to be termed annex. They also have a child psychiatry clinic where diagnoses can be made. In the different provinces, we now have pediatricians who have passed through these centers as part of their training and are able to make basic diagnoses of these children and make basic referrals, with only complex cases being referred through to the central hospitals.
Thank you so much for that sharing. Viewers, I think you've heard it for yourself. Early detection, early diagnosis is very key for someone who's walking through this path. Let's take a short break to join me in the next segment. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers, to our program, Wholeness with Naomi. Before we went on a short break, Dr. Mudawarima was sharing with us some of the practical tools and resources that one can use for them to be able to access services for a child who has autism, or even for the diagnosis of autism. Dr. Mudawarima, what are some of the coping mechanisms that either parents or guardians can use as they take care of a child with autism?
So I think the first thing that I want to say is to encourage people to steer away from unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as use of substances and, etc., gambling, that kind of thing. We really don't want that, because I think it's going to create a bigger problem. I think our biggest strength is community. So firstly, within that family setup, leveraging the supports that we would traditionally have. So traditionally, if I have a stressful situation with a child, I would approach a tete, I would approach a babamnini to ask them to come in and help and support. So communicating with the people that are around us, leveraging the grandmothers, the grandfathers, and the other people, vazukuru, who we have in our communities, so that we get that support within the family. The other thing is to also seek other people who have lived the experience.
Thank you for that.
Because there are people who may have navigated things that are similar to the things that you are seeing. As medical practitioners, I'm going to talk about it from a medical perspective and be prescriptive about it. But some people may have maneuvered differently, and because of that, they may be better able to help. They will not necessarily be prescriptive in the way that I would be prescriptive as a medical practitioner, but encourage from the perspective of knowledge that it may come to pass, or even if it doesn't come to pass, you will eventually figure out a way to navigate your way through life. The same way that we sometimes have problems that we can't necessarily get rid of, but somehow we just have to pass through. And in the goodness of time, that support is what you really need, people who have lived that experience. The other place that people can find support is within their areas of faith. And different people will have different areas of faith and different ways of going about it. I'm not going to prescribe that one should go to XYZ church because that is where they're going to get support, but to try and engage, within their church communities. The other thing that I really want to strongly say is for those people who are in those, support communities, the church, it is not the fault of the parent. The behavior of this child does not grant you the right to be judgmental or, to make nasty comments or to shun people who are just trying their best to do their best for their children, who are actually trying to bring up their children within their faith, even though they realize that there is difficulty. This might be a child who doesn't necessarily sit down during the time that they're supposed to sit down, or who may vocalize, loudly at times when being quiet is expected. But if we can't go to our places of faith in order to get the support that we need, then where do we go as human beings? So I really want to encourage, the places of faith to be supportive of individuals who have children with disability in general and children with autism spectrum disorder in particular.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mudawarima. That is quite deep and profound. There is a parent who's watching the show and who has a child who has been diagnosed with autism, and they have many questions in their mind or in their head, They're thinking, will my child be normal again? Can my child experience A, B, C, D in their lives like other children? What words do you have for them?
The experience of every individual is going to be different. And it may be a path where we end up with things improving, or it may be a path where things stay the same. I just want to hope that families seek the help that they need in order to be able to cope with what is on the table at the time. And I just want to encourage them to walk the best walk that they can, so that they do their best for their children, the child who has autism and the ones who do not have autism. It's not an easy road, and I don't want to leave here with false platitudes and say that it's going to be okay. It might not be okay, it might be very difficult, but I just hope that families can navigate and find the strength that they need in order to cope.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mudawarima. It was quite insightful as you were sharing about autism. I've also learned a lot through his sharing today. Viewers, this is something that is quite difficult, as you said, and sometimes the journey is not a straight line. It has its parts which are hard, which are deep, which are difficult. And sometimes living in a community can be tough. The very place where you're expecting support, it might not come as expected. But in that, I encourage you to keep on going. This is a journey that others have gone ahead and they've overcome. Who are those people around you? Which support systems do you have around you that will enable you to be able to continue walking as you come to a place of acceptance of what your child has? Grieve for as many times as you can. Grieve for that loss of, I may not be able to hear my child say, Mama. Grieve for that loss of functionality that may be there in your child. Grief is an emotional response to loss. Identify yourself with all the different emotions that you may be finding yourself experiencing. The anger that may come, the depression that may come. Sit in with it. Understand what they are saying to you. Only then will it be much possible for you to be able to come out and come to a place of acceptance and continue your journey. Join me, viewers, in the next episode. But in the meantime, let's continue on Wholeness. Thank you.